Hi everyone, welcome to another video. Today I want to share with you how I made this monochromatic card, and I'm going to be using Clair stamps for that today. Before I do that, I want to remind you to follow me across social media if you haven't already. Those links will be in the description box below. Also, while you're down there, you can subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. And if you enjoyed this video, the thumbs up button always helps. For my first part of my stamping today, I'm going to be using the Martha's Flowers stamp set from Clair Stamps. This is named after Martha, who is on the design team. She's fabulous, and so is this stamp set. But I'm going to be using the largest flower bouquet that's in this set. I'm using my Misty to do my stamping today, and I'm stamping onto some craft cardstock. My cardstock measures 4 inches by 5 1/4. So slightly smaller than A2 size. I went ahead and lined up my stamp on the left-hand side. I want it hanging off the top, the bottom, and the left-hand side. And I'm prepping my cardstock with my embossing bag because I'll be doing some heat embossing. My favorite way to heat emboss is, well, most of the time I should say, is with my Versamark ink pad. There are some exceptions, but I'm going to ink that stamp up with the Versamark ink. Versamark ink is a clear sticky ink that just it applies a little bit of color. It's a watermark pad, so you just get a darker tone than what the cardstock is. But it's very sticky. It stays wet for a long time, so it's going to grab onto that embossing powder, hold on to it, and allow us to heat emboss. So I inked that stamp up and stamped it down about 3 times. It's a rather large stamp, so that's why I used my Misty for that. And once I had it a good coverage with the stamp, I'm going to go ahead and apply some copper embossing powder. I like to apply my embossing powder over a coffee filter. It just catches all the little stray powders. They're very cheap, so if you have some stubborn little granules that won't go back in the container, it's not a big deal to throw your coffee filter away. Plus, they are not plastic or anything like that, so you don't feel so bad throwing them away. I like to clean up my embossing with a dry paintbrush if I get any places where embossing powder is stuck that I don't want it. Then I come in with my heat gun, let it heat up for a few seconds, and then bring it to my paper, and then melt my embossing powder. I start at one corner and go to the other in a case like this, and just kind of work my way up the cardstock. Now I let that sit for a minute. I did not put my magnet over it while it was still hot embossing powder. You do want to be careful when it's still warm, but I let it cool for a few seconds, and then I will pop my paper back into my Misty. I'm lining up my stamp again on the left-hand side. I flip my paper around. You can see I'm using Creative Corners from Misty in the bottom right-hand corner of my Misty stamping tool. That allows my paper to sit away from the bottom edge and the right side edge. In this case, I'm really focusing on that bottom edge, so that way I don't have my cardstock hanging out in the center of the Misty, and I don't have a corner to line it up if it shifts. This is just a lifesaver for larger stamps like this. Now for this stamping, I didn't go quite as far onto the center of the paper. I wanted this one a little bit thinner. Again, stamped it down a few times with the Versamark ink. I did prep my surface for a second time with my embossing bag. Then applied my embossing powder, same copper embossing powder, and heat set. Once I had that done, it was time to start the coloring. Now this is the best part of this card, and I'm doing a monochromatic card. So I went with craft cardstock. I've done my copper embossing powder. So now I'm going to go for some really warm, more brownish tones for my coloring. I'm using my Prismacolors today. They work really well over craft cardstock. These are a wax-based colored pencil. And even though I have a very large set of these pencils, I'm keeping my palette very limited. So I have just chosen out the French gray colors. So it goes like 10%, 20%, 30%, up to 90%. And I've also added in a white. I am just using these in different combinations to color in all of these flowers. So even though I have just this very limited set of colored pencils that I'm using, each flower is going to look a little bit different because I'm switching up the combinations that I'm using. Some of these flowers I'm going to go in with a very light hand as well. Some of them I'll really stack up the color and build it up for a very intense look. Also, I'm going to go very dark on some. On some of these, I'm going to go very light. So it's just about using different techniques. Some of them I'll use a circular motion to do my coloring. Others I'll do more of a feathering motion where I'll get those very fine lines. I like to just use a limited color palette when I'm doing monochromatic cards like this and just switch it up like I'm doing here. That way everything still coordinates very well and I don't have to do a lot of digging through my colored pencils to find different ones that are going to match. This just helps me out and makes my coloring a lot more quicker and it all looks more cohesive on a card design like this. Now I went ahead and colored the left side that I'm showing here, and I did color the right side off camera, but I thought one coloring session was quite enough. There you can see a close-up of that coloring. Again, even though I used only about 7 or 8 pencils maybe, I had a variety of different looking flowers that I ended up with. Once I was done with the coloring on both sides, I'm going to take some fine point scissors and quickly fussy cut along the edges of these. So I'm not cutting the straight edge at all, just the inside edges where the flowers are going to overhang each other. I fussy cut that very quickly on both sides. I left a little bit of a border and I'm just going to leave that as is. There's a closer look at the cutting so you can see that little bit of a border I left, and it's super easy to do. Now, before I move on to putting those onto a panel, I'm going to go ahead and add a little something to that panel that I'll be placing them on. So this is, again, 4 1/4 by 5, or no, 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches, same size as my craft panel I started off with, but this is white cardstock. Now, white is a great kind of just neutral color to use on your monochromatic cards. However, this one was going more on the vintagey side, so I felt like stark white was just too much. What I decided to do was take this stencil from the Crafter's Workshop and I'm going to add a little bit of that fringy or plaid look onto my background. I'm using these makeup brushes. I have a review on them. I will leave that linked in the top right hand corner, but they add just a nice little soft wash of color, and I'm using icing on the cake, which is a nice brown, very neutral brown ink from Catherine Pooler that goes very well with this card design. But just by adding that little bit of brown and pattern to the background, it really helped pull it in and not be so incredibly stark of a background. That background is also going to be where I place my sentiment. So in order to get that placed just right to where the flowers aren't going to cover it up, again, I'm using my Misty. I'm using that Creative Corners so I can go ahead and bump my cardstock away, but I'm also going to go ahead and place my flowers right over the top of that panel where they're going to eventually be. I didn't want to place them down yet because I will be heat embossing, and I didn't want the heat embossing to get stuck to those panels or the glue that's going to hold them down. So I went ahead, placed those down, and use that as the guide to go ahead and place my sentiment down. Then I can go ahead and remove those panels and stamp my sentiment just onto that background. Again, prep my surface with my anti-static tool, and I'm stamping down with my Versamark ink. I am using the You Got This stamp set from Clair. I absolutely love this sentiment set. It's full of really encouraging sentiments, which are just fantastic, and there's so many to choose from. I like to build them up and make it a whole card like you'll see I do with this one. But for the front of the card, I'm going to go ahead and stamp It's Gonna Be Okay. And again, very nice, just very neutral font. It's going to go with anything. I've got more of a vintagey, a little on the fancier side card going on here today, and it still looks great. So I stamped that down, heat embossed with the same copper embossing powder. That's another thing with monochromatic cards. If you're going to do them, keep carrying the same colors. So I'm not going to bring in a different brown embossing powder for this. I'm going to go ahead and use that same copper embossing powder to tie in to those 2 panels that I colored with the flowers. That's just going to carry the eye all the way across the card. Now, for those 2 flower panels, I went ahead and added some foam tape on the back of them and placed them right down onto that panel. That little bit of dimension adds the tiniest bit of shadow and really helps just add even more to this card. for that panel. I'm going to pop that onto an A2 white top folding card base, but I'm using it horizontally today. I'm using just regular double-sided adhesive to place that down, and that is the front of the card. I absolutely love the way this turned out, and I love that it's so monochromatic. I think it's absolutely gorgeous, and I wasn't sure where I was going with this card when I first started. It was just kind of one that happened. So I didn't have a plan, but I'm so happy with the way it turned out. For the inside of the card, I'm going to go ahead and again use my Misty, and I'm using that Martha's Flowers stamp set, but I pulled a different flower arrangement out of there. I'm going to line that up with the inside of my card base and stamp that down off to the left just a little bit, but centered from the top and bottom. Now I stamped that down with icing on the cake ink from Catherine Pooler a few times. And then right in where that goes into a circular, I placed my sentiment for the inside, which says, "Just breathe." I am going to add a little bit of color to this. I think this rose petal color from Catherine Pooler goes really well with the aesthetic of this card. So I'm going to go ahead and stamp that down a few times with that rose petal ink to finish off the inside of the card, and that does it. I hope you guys enjoyed this video and a look at how I made this fun card. There are going to be links on the left side of your screen you can click on. You can also subscribe to my channel over there as well. Don't forget all the information that's down in the description box, like the supplies and social media links. That does it for me. Thanks for watching and happy crafting.